Look at him, Katie said, loud enough that 3 tables heard it before I did. 25 years later, and he still dresses like he's about to go pour concrete somewhere. Her friends laughed the way people laugh when they've already decided who the joke is on before anybody said anything funny. I didn't turn around right away. I finished stirring my coffee, set the little silver spoon down on the saucer, and only then looked up. The ballroom was doing what reunion ballrooms always do. Low chandelier light, a jazz trio working through something soft near the bar, name tags with faded yearbook photos that made everyone look faintly like strangers wearing their own faces from 25 years ago. I'd been in the room maybe 10 minutes, long enough to shake 4 hands, hug Angela twice, before Katie found me. She'd always had a gift for finding the exact moment a room was listening. "Katie," I said. "Even, not cold, just even." "Peter," she said back, drawing the word out like she was testing whether it still had the same weight it used to. She looked good, she always did, but there was something new in the way she held herself, a kind of practiced confidence I didn't remember from before. "You didn't RSVP. Half of us weren't sure you'd show." "Wasn't sure myself for a while," I admitted. "Still doing the construction thing?" she asked, glancing at my plain suit, my plain watch. Like she was cataloging evidence for a case she'd already decided the verdict on. "Still doing the construction thing," I said, which was true, in the same way that saying a river is still doing the water thing is true. "My name is Peter Rush. I'm 43 years old, and if you'd asked me 8 years ago what I thought tonight would look like, standing in a hotel ballroom in downtown Atlanta at my 25th high school reunion, I would not have guessed any of it. Not the ballroom, not the reunion, and certainly not the woman across the room, laughing at me with a glass of champagne in her hand, a diamond ring catching the chandelier light on her left hand that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen her. I want to tell you something before we go any further, because it matters more than anything that happens later tonight. A man's worth was never supposed to be measured by what people say about him in a room. It's measured by what he does when the room isn't looking. My father used to say that to me while we were up on scaffolding together on Saturday mornings when I was 16. Sweat running into my eyes, hauling lumber, because that's what our family did instead of vacations. I didn't understand it then. I understand it completely now. Katie didn't know what I'd built since she'd left. Nobody in that ballroom did. What they knew was the version of me that had stayed behind 8 years ago, a guy who used to talk about building something someday. Apparently still just talking, while she'd gone off and, from the look of that ring, found herself a whole new life. There was a man standing close beside her, in a suit that fit him the way an expensive suit fits someone who bought it to impress people, rather than because it was comfortable. His name, I'd learned soon enough, was Andy Davis. What I noticed first wasn't his face. It was his eyes, and where they kept landing. Not on mine. On my watch, a plain steel one I'd worn every day for 9 years, the one that used to belong to my father. He wasn't admiring it. He was doing math with it, the way a man does when he's sizing up whether you're worth his time. Before we go further, I want you to sit with something my grandmother used to say to me on the porch of her house in East Point, rocking in a chair that had been creaking since before I was born. "Baby, the people who talk loudest about your failures are usually the ones most scared you're about to prove them wrong." She raised 6 children on a school cafeteria salary and never once, in 81 years, raised her voice at another human being that I ever witnessed. She used to say patience wasn't the same thing as doing nothing. It was doing everything, quietly, while the people around you assumed you were doing nothing at all. She was right about almost everything. She was right about this too. Let me take you back a little, because that's really where this story begins, not in the ballroom, but in a much quieter place. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. 20 minutes before Katie found me, Angela had pulled me aside near the check-in table, wine glass already in hand, giving me the same look she'd been giving me for weeks. "You made it," she said. "I half expected you to bail in the parking lot." "Considered it," I admitted. "Sat out there for a solid 10 minutes. And? And I figured a grown man shouldn't need a pep talk to walk into a hotel ballroom, I said, which made her laugh, because we both knew that was exactly what I'd needed. Angela had been the one pushing me toward the reunion for weeks. We'd known each other since middle school, and she had zero patience for my avoidance. "You've spent 8 years quietly rebuilding your whole life, Peter," she'd told me over the phone the week before. "Go to that reunion. Not to prove anything, just to close a door you never actually shut." I'd almost said no more than once. I had a good, quiet life by then, a house in a neighborhood full of oak trees, a wife who loved me steadily and without conditions, work that actually mattered to the city I grew up in. I didn't need Katie's approval, or anybody else's from that gymnasium 25 years ago, to know who I was. But something in me wanted to walk back into that room one time, not as the man who'd left broken, but simply as myself. Angela had squeezed my arm once, right before she drifted off toward some old classmates near the photo booth, and said the thing she always says before she leaves me to fend for myself in a crowded room. "Just be yourself." That's always been more than enough, even when you didn't believe it. I was still turning that over in my mind, wine in hand, when Katie found me. We met at 19, both of us working summer shifts at a hardware store off Cascade Road, her at the register, me hauling lumber in the back lot in 95-degree heat. She used to sneak me a cold soda from the break room fridge when the manager wasn't looking, and I used to save her the good scraps of trim wood so she could build little birdhouses she sold at a farmer's market on weekends. She had this laugh back then, an honest one, nothing performed about it, and I fell for her somewhere between the third soda and the fifth birdhouse. We dated 2 years before I asked her to marry me. We married at 21, in her aunt's church with maybe 60 people, and a reception in the fellowship hall with folding tables and my mother's sweet tea. We stayed married 14 years, through a genuinely good stretch, and then through a slower unraveling before she left. 14 years is a long time to build something with somebody. It's an even longer time to watch it come apart one quiet disappointment at a time. The first 5 years were good. I mean that honestly. Katie wanted things, a nicer house, a certain kind of life, the validation that comes from other people being impressed by what you've built. There's nothing wrong with wanting things. I wanted things too. But somewhere in our late 20s, the wanting started to curdle into a restlessness that no house, no promotion, no certification program ever quite satisfied. I kept thinking the next thing would finally let her exhale. It never was. Eventually, I understood the exhale she needed had to come from somewhere inside her, and I couldn't reach in and hand it to her no matter how hard I worked. There was the year I sold my grandfather's set of framing tools, the good steel ones I'd used to put myself through my first construction job, to help cover a certification program she wanted badly. I never told her what it cost me. I didn't want her carrying that weight. There was the year I turned down a foreman promotion, 2 states over, better pay, real security, because she didn't want to leave Atlanta while her sister was going through a hard patch. I said yes without hesitating, picked up side work on weekends instead. Came home with my hands split open, telling myself it didn't matter as long as she was happy. I found out about the affair about a year before she finally left. I won't dwell on it, because it's not really the point of tonight, and dwelling on it never built anything worth having. I stayed anyway, because I believed if I was patient enough, steady enough, successful enough, she'd eventually look at what she had and choose it. She didn't. On a Tuesday morning 8 years ago, she packed 2 suitcases and told me she'd already found an apartment. I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching her zip the second one shut, the house so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. She didn't cry. I didn't either. Not then. "Say something," she said, pausing at the door. "Drive safe," I said. "Call me when you're settled so I know you got there okay." She left. I didn't chase her down the driveway. I let her go, and I went quiet. Some folks mistake quiet for broken. They are never ever the same thing. About a year after the divorce, Katie took a job in Charlotte and moved 4 hours away. Our daughter Maya was 10 then. And for a couple of years she split time between us, a long drive on either end most months. By the time Maya started high school, she asked to stay in Atlanta full time. Her friends were here, her school was here, and if I'm honest, So was I. And she knew it. Katie didn't fight her on it. To her credit, in this one specific area, she never once made Maya a weapon between us. And I've always respected her for that, even in the years everything else between us felt far from respectable. Katie stayed in Charlotte the better part of 7 years. She moved back to Atlanta only 3 months before that reunion. A fresh start, she told Maya, a new job, a chance to be closer to her aging mother. She met Andy Davis less than 6 weeks after she unpacked her last box. Andy hadn't said a word to me directly yet, but he'd been watching the whole exchange with a kind of restless attention, like a man doing arithmetic he didn't want anyone catching him at. "You're the ex," he finally said, extending a hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Andy, I'm in private equity." "Peter," I said, shaking it once. "Construction, right?" He said, like he was placing a bet he was confident about. "Katie mentioned you two went way back. Same graduating class." "Same graduating class," I agreed. His eyes drifted again to my watch, then, briefly, to the plain wedding band on my hand. I watched him try to reconcile something in his head and fail, the way people do when the numbers in front of them refuse to add up to the story they'd already decided on. I didn't know it yet, standing there, but Andy Sinclair had a habit. He collected watches the way some men collect stories, not to wear them, but to know their worth on sight, because knowing the price of things quickly was, in his line of work, a survival skill. What he didn't know is that the model on my wrist wasn't for sale, had never been for sale, and its value had nothing to do with dollars at all. "We're engaged," Katie said, holding up her hand for anyone who hadn't already noticed the ring. 3 weeks now. Andy's built an incredible fund. Real estate, infrastructure, the whole portfolio. She said the word infrastructure like she was testing whether it might land a blow. "Congratulations," I said, and meant the part where I hoped she'd finally found something steady, even if some old, tired part of me already had questions about how fast this had all moved. I saw the room shift before I saw her. Conversations dipped by half a register, the way a crowd does when something worth noticing walks in. I turned, and there was Teresa, in a deep emerald dress, hair loose the way she wears it when she's had a long week, and finally gets to exhale, moving through the ballroom like she belonged in every room she'd ever entered. Because she did. She found me easily, she always does, and slid her hand into mine like it was the most natural motion in the world. "Sorry I'm late," she said, kissing my cheek. Client meeting ran long, a woman finalizing her protective order paperwork. I didn't want to rush her out the door just because I had a party to get to. I should tell you properly who Teresa is, because it matters for everything that happens next. She spent years as a compliance investigator for a regional banking oversight office before she left to found and run the Ashford Center, a legal aid and advocacy nonprofit here in Atlanta that supports women rebuilding their lives after divorce, abuse, or financial exploitation, free legal help, safety planning, and, more and more in recent years, help for women who'd been quietly drained of their savings by men who were very, very good at being charming. I met her about a year after my own divorce, on a job site where she'd stopped by in an oversight capacity to check permits near a daycare center my crew was renovating. She caught a dust barrier violation I'd missed and made me fix it before lunch. We didn't start dating for another 8 months after that. Neither of us was in a hurry, and I've come to believe that was exactly the right pace for two people who'd both been burned by moving too fast toward things that looked right instead of things that actually were. We married 3 years ago. She never once needed me to prove my worth to her. She simply paid attention, the way she'd paid attention to those dust barriers, and decided for herself what she saw. "This is Teresa," I said to Katie and Andy. "My wife." "Peter," Katie said, recovering her composure with visible effort. "You didn't mention your wife was." She paused, searching for a word that wouldn't sound as transparent as it was. "So lovely." "You didn't ask," I said. "Not cruel. Just true." Teresa extended her hand warmly to Katie, because that's who she is, gracious even to people who don't deserve it yet. Then she turned to Andy. Something in her face changed. Small, almost nothing. "If you didn't know her the way I do, you'd have missed it entirely," A half-second flicker of recognition, quickly smoothed back into a polite, professional smile. "Andy," she said, shaking his hand. "Nice to meet you." "Likewise," he said, already looking past her towards someone more useful to talk to. Teresa didn't say anything else about it right then, but I felt her hand tighten just slightly around mine. I want to be honest with you, I hadn't come to that reunion expecting to be the center of anything. I'd come because my old friend Angela had spent a week telling me it was time to close a door I'd left cracked open for 8 years, and because some quiet part of me wanted to walk back into that room one time, not as the man who'd left broken, but simply as myself. What I hadn't planned on, what I genuinely hadn't seen coming, was the reunion committee chair, a classmate named Carla Simmons, stepping up to the small stage near the dance floor and tapping the microphone. Before we get too far into the evening, Carla said, "I want to do something I wasn't originally planning to do, because I'd been asked to keep it quiet. But given some of what I've overheard tonight, I've changed my mind." My stomach dropped, because I already knew, roughly, where this was going. "Most of you don't know this," Carla went on, "but this ballroom, this catering, the band, even the scholarship raffle we're running tonight for graduating seniors at our old high school, all of it was fully underwritten by one of our own classmates, who asked specifically to remain anonymous. He didn't want a toast. He didn't want a plaque. But I think our class ought to know who made tonight possible, and I think he ought to hear us say thank you out loud instead of behind his back." She looked directly across the room. "Peter Rush funded this entire reunion. And while I had the floor, I did a little digging. Because I was curious, that man also quietly funded the renovation of the rec center on Delow Drive 2 years ago. And he's the reason 40 kids from our old district have full-ride scholarships to trade and engineering programs through a fund named after his father. So, Peter, thank you. From all of us." The applause that followed was real, and it went on longer than I was comfortable with. I stood there with my hand raised in something between a wave and surrender, wishing the floor would open up. While 140 former classmates rearranged everything they thought they knew about me in real time. I watched Katie's face very closely in that moment, because I couldn't help it. The color left it slowly, like watching a light dim on a rheostat instead of a switch. Her mouth opened slightly. Nothing came out. Beside her, Andy's expression did something else entirely, a flicker of recalculation, fast and cold, the look of a man realizing he'd been standing next to the wrong target all night. "That's," Katie finally managed, voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her in years. "That's you? All of it? You paid for all of this?" "I didn't want it to be about that," I said, and meant it. She had no response ready. For the first time all night, she didn't have one single thing to say. Here's the part of the story that turns this from a simple night of humbled pride into something with real weight, so stay with me. About 5 weeks before that reunion, 2 women had come separately to the Ashford Center asking for help. Both had recently separated from long marriages. Both had met a charming, well-dressed man within weeks of their divorces finalizing, a man who talked fast about real estate funds and infrastructure plays, who moved the relationship toward engagement almost immediately, and who'd walked away from each of them with a 5-figure investment that simply evaporated the moment anyone asked for paperwork. Neither woman had a full name for him. One knew him as Trey. The other only had a first name and a blurry photo from a restaurant receipt camera a friend had taken as a joke. Teresa had flagged the pattern immediately. It wasn't the first time she'd seen this exact playbook, and she'd already opened a file with a detective she worked with regularly in the financial crimes unit, cross-referencing the description against similar complaints in neighboring counties. What she hadn't had, until that moment on the ballroom floor, was a face. Now she did. She didn't make a scene. She didn't say a word to Katie that night, beyond simple courtesy. That's not how Teresa operates, and it's part of why I love her the way I do. She excused herself 20 minutes later, stepped into the hotel corridor, and sent a single text to Detective Alvarez, "I think I just met Trey. Ballroom at the Regency downtown. Real name may be Andy Davis. Call you first thing tomorrow with everything." The next morning, Teresa sat at our kitchen table with her laptop, 2 case files, and a legal pad, and worked for 6 hours straight. She pulled the photo from the previous complainant's file, compared it against a picture Angela had quietly taken at the reunion the night before, without anyone noticing, and confirmed what she'd suspected in the corridor. She drafted a formal statement, attached the corroborating details from both existing complainants, and filed everything with Detective Alvarez's office by that afternoon. Not out of anything to do with Katie, or me, or the reunion at all, but because it was exactly the work she did every single week for women who had nobody else looking out for them. This isn't about Katie, she told me that evening, and I believed her completely. Because I know her. If it helps her too, fine, but I'd have filed this exact complaint if I'd seen his face at the grocery store. 4 days later, detectives obtained a warrant. They arrested Andy Davis outside his apartment on a Wednesday morning, on charges connecting him to at least 3 victims across 2 counties, with investigators saying at the time that they expected the number to grow once his financial records were fully unwound. Katie called me the night of the arrest. And she was furious in a way I hadn't heard from her since the worst days near the end of our marriage. "You couldn't just let me have this one thing," she said, voice shaking. "You had to make sure it went down at your wife's little organization. Y'all have been jealous of me since the second I walked in that ballroom with a ring on my finger, and this is how you handle it? You destroy him?" "Katie, don't," she said. "Don't act like this is some coincidence. Teresa's had it out for me since the day she shook Andy's hand. I saw her face. I didn't argue with her that night. There's a particular kind of hurt that doesn't hear reason yet, no matter how true the reason is, and I've learned the hard way that trying to force it usually just makes the wound angrier." I told her I was sorry she was in pain, and I meant it, and I let the call end there. 2 days after that, Detective Alvarez called Katie directly as part of building the case and walked her through the full file. Bank statements showing the same investment pattern repeated with 4 different women in 18 months, each one within months of a divorce or a death in the family. Each one moved toward engagement inside of 6 weeks. Messages from an entirely separate fiancé in Savannah that Andy had been actively engaged to at the exact same time he'd proposed to Katie, a woman named Sophia who'd been planning a wedding for October. The same month, 300 miles away, entirely unaware Katie existed. Photos of a storage unit full of gifts, watches, jewelry, one still in its box, purchased with money that had come out of other women's divorce settlements, kept, investigators believed, as a kind of rotating inventory to re-gift to whichever woman he was courting next. Katie called me that same night, and this time there was no fury in her voice at all. Just a kind of exhausted, hollowed-out quiet I recognized, because I'd worn that same quiet myself once, a long time ago. "I'm so sorry," she said. "I said terrible things to you and to Teresa, and none of it was true, and I knew it wasn't true even while I was saying it. I just couldn't stand the idea that you two had been right about him and I'd been that easy to fool." "You weren't fooled because you're foolish," I said. "You were fooled because he's very good at what he does, and because you just moved to a new city looking for a fresh start, and he knew exactly how to find women in that exact moment and be whatever they needed him to be. That's not a character flaw in you, Katie. That's a crime he committed against you." She cried for a long while on the other end of the line, and I let her. Because some things don't need fixing in the moment. They just need somebody willing to stay on the phone. "Will you tell Teresa I'm sorry?" she asked eventually. "Properly, not just through you. Tell her yourself," I said. "She'd want to hear it from you." Katie did call her 2 days later. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, and I never asked what was said. Some conversations belong only to the 2 people having them. About 3 weeks after that, Katie asked if she could take Maya and me to lunch. The 3 of us, nothing formal, just a diner near her mother's place in East Point. Teresa wasn't there. By design, Katie had asked separately if she could see her another time. One-on-one, and Teresa had said yes without hesitation. Lunch with Maya was easy, the way it usually is when a 17-year-old is in the room to keep the adults from taking themselves too seriously. But near the end, when Maya stepped away to the counter for a to-go box, Katie reached across the table and put her hand over mine, briefly, the way she used to a long time ago. "I spent 8 years telling myself a story where I was fine, and you were the one who'd stayed small," she said. It was easier than admitting I'd traded something real for the idea of something impressive, and then gotten fooled by a worse version of the same mistake twice. You're allowed to have gotten it wrong, I said. Twice even, that doesn't erase the good years, and it doesn't make you a fool. It just makes you somebody who was looking for something and hadn't found it yet. Have you? She asked. Found it? Every ordinary morning, I said. That's usually where it's been hiding. She laughed at that, a real laugh. The first honest one I'd heard from her in a long time, and for the first time in 8 years, it didn't cost either of us anything to sit across a table from each other. The following week she met Teresa for coffee near the Ashford Center, and whatever was said between them, Teresa came home lighter than she'd been in days, and that was enough for me. I want to slow down here, because this next part matters more to me than anything else in this whole story. Maya is 17 now, a senior, applying to engineering programs. And she wants to study civil engineering. She's never once told me it's because of me, and I've never asked her to say it. But I notice things. I noticed the sketchbook she used to fill with bridge designs when she was 11. I noticed that she still asks to come by job sites, just to watch. She'd been the one, oddly enough, who first told me about the scholarship fund working, though she had no idea it was connected to me. About a week after the reunion, she called on a Wednesday evening, mostly to talk about nothing in particular, and near the end mentioned, almost as an afterthought, a scholarship she'd been awarded through something called the Robert Rush Memorial Fund. I looked him up, she said. There's barely anything online. Just an old construction company and a mention in a newspaper archive about a building collapse he helped investigate the safety standards on afterward. That's your great-grandfather, I said. My dad's father. He didn't talk about himself much. Wasn't really his way. Runs in the family, huh, she said, and I could hear the smile in it. I told her the truth then, about the fund, and why I'd never mentioned it to her, and why I'd wanted her to earn her way into engineering because it lit something up in her, not because of any name attached to it. So I didn't actually win anything? She asked, careful, like she was bracing for the scholarship to feel smaller now that she knew. You did, I said quickly. The selection committee doesn't know who applies personally. I made sure of that years ago, specifically so this could never happen, so nobody could ever say you got it because of who your father is. Your essay about designing infrastructure that actually serves the neighborhoods it's built in was the strongest one they read. I found out you'd won at the same time you did. I promise you that. She was quiet a moment, a different kind of quiet this time. Okay, she said, softer, that actually means a lot more, knowing that. I want to end this story somewhere quieter than a ballroom, because that's where the truest parts of it actually live. Weeks later, once all of it had finally settled, I stood on our back porch with a cup of coffee, looking out at the oak trees a few blocks over that lead, down toward the park. Atlanta does that particular pale gray in late October, a sky that hasn't decided anything yet. Teresa came out a few minutes later, wrapped in an old cardigan she refuses to replace no matter how many new ones I buy her, and handed me a second cup, even though I still had one going lukewarm in my other hand. A cold cup of coffee, she always says, is just a reminder to slow down, not a mistake to fix. Do you regret it? I asked her. Filing that complaint the moment you got home, on a night that was supposed to just be a party? She thought about it honestly before she answered, because that's who she is. No, she said. I'd have filed it if I'd met him anywhere else, on any other night, attached to any other person. That's not a hard question for me, Peter, it never has been. She leaned her head against my shoulder. The hard part was watching Katie's face while I did it. I know what she is to you, even now. I didn't do it to hurt her. I did it because 3 other women needed somebody to. I know, I said. I've never once doubted that. We stood there a long while, coffee going lukewarm in our hands, watching the wind move slow through the trees. Later that afternoon, I called Angela to thank her for pushing me to go that night. You knew, didn't you? I said, that something like this might happen. I didn't know the details. She laughed. I just knew you were finally ready to stop carrying all of it alone. Then, softer, your grandmother would have been proud of how you handled that room, Peter, calm as still water. She used to tell me patience wasn't the same thing as doing nothing, I said. Most of us take 20 years to understand what our grandmothers said in about 10 seconds, Angela said, and I could hear the smile in it. That's just how wisdom works. It waits for you. This story reminds us that real healing rarely arrives with fireworks. It shows up in small, deliberate choices, made quietly, long before anyone's applauding, and sometimes in the unglamorous, unhesitating work of somebody simply doing their job well, without a single thought for who it might embarrass along the way. Peter didn't win that night, because a room finally found out what he was worth. He won because he'd spent 8 quiet years building a life so steady, it no longer needed a single person's approval to stand up straight on its own, and because he'd chosen, without ever quite planning to, a partner who did the right thing whether or not anybody was clapping for her. Katie didn't lose that night because she got humiliated in front of her old classmates. She lost, for a little while, because she'd gone looking for a fresh start in the arms of the first person who told her exactly what she wanted to hear. What she found afterward: a daughter who still loved her, an ex-husband who didn't gloat, and a woman she'd been ready to call an enemy who'd fought for her, without being asked. Turned out to be worth more than the fresh start ever could have been. That kind of peace is available to all of us. It's just built one ordinary morning at a time. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.